For tonight's presentation, we have a virtual audience at a distance. Some people, I think there's a few people here also in Abu Dhabi who can't be with us. So just to give you a little bit of a feeling about how things are going to work today, we'll have, and I'll explain this in just, again, when we get to the slide, we're going to have a part which is, like right now, a recorded webinar. And then we're going to stop that webinar and we'll have an open Q&A. And then we're going to have an introductory session after that, which will also not be recorded. So just this part is being recorded for the first part. So my name is David Wrisley, Professor of Digital Humanities here at NYU Abu Dhabi. It's really a great pleasure to have you all here. Thank you for sharing your iftar with us today. My colleague, Suphan Kirmizialtin, is going to be speaking with me tonight. We're going to kind of go in alternation a bit. So we might have a little bit of stand up, sit down from the screen. This is, as you know, a two-part seminar. And the title of the seminar is Unlocking Archives with AI. And you can see AI 1 here on the screen. It's not 1 because it's a version, it's just a 1 because it's number 1, Tuesday. There'll be another slide deck, which is number 2 for Thursday. So for those of you both in the room, but also on the call, we need, what we want to do is to share the slides with you. I know that some people don't see things very far at a screen, on the screen. You may want to see it up close, but this is especially for those who are following us from a distance, because I know that slides on a recorded Zoom call cannot be great. And that's the way they're appearing at a distance. So if you have a device and you'd like to follow on that device, the address for this is tinyurl.com/HRF for Humanities Research Fellowship Unlocking as the first name of the seminar we suggest. This, feel free also, if you want to, you can take a picture of this. This will be up through the week. So you'll have access to these slides. This might be important for those of you who are coming on Thursday. If you're interested in the more hands-on part, today's is today, and we'll have another set of slides and another URL for that day. So again, as I said, the first part of the talk, so this is basically a research talk in the first part, what handwritten text recognition can help us do. And this is the part which is recorded. So again, if you have the slides, these are our bios. These are also available on the hrfarabworld.org website. Myself and my colleague Suphan Kirmizialtin. So just a word about the sponsorship of this seminar. This seminar is being sponsored by the Humanities Research Fellowship for the Study of the Arab World. Again, that link, hrf-arabworld.org. Gives you also an idea about the other kinds of things that are going on in the series. We decided to do this as a post-iftar Ramadan exercise this year. It's the first time I've ever done this, so hopefully it goes well for you. So in the talk that we're going to give tonight, one thing which is very important to say, actually like most AI work, is that there's a lot of people and a lot of labor hidden behind all of the models and all of the projects. So we have a number of people here on the screen, which actually interestingly reflect the kind of diversity that we have in the room today, going from students to postdocs, to faculty members, librarians, etc. A lot of people who helped us on different projects put together the materials that we're going to be speaking about. And when I say materials, I don't mean the slides and the presentation tonight per se, but I mean the work on the background in creating the data that's required to do the kind of work that we're going to speak about. So thank you to everyone who has collaborated with us. So here's our plan for the seminar for the 2 days. The first day, we have sort of 4 parts, more or less, or 4 general topics. The first one is on collaborative efforts in research data. Second one's on recent developments in AI. And particularly where recent developments in AI are important for people who study text, like humanists. The third, OCR versus HTR. You may know these, if these words, these abbreviations come up and they're a bit strange. Let us know OCR, optical character recognition, versus HDR, handwritten text recognition. And then we have 3 case studies that we're going to be speaking about tonight, in which we've used handwritten text recognition technologies to dive for deep dives into specific problems in the humanities. And I hope that those are interesting to you. The Q&A, at that point, we will stop the webinar. And then after that, the Q&A, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Anybody has any questions. And then finally, we have our introduction, how to get ready if you're coming on Thursday. If you're not coming on Thursday at the Q&A, you can leave if you want. You can also sit around for the rest if you like for Thursday, but that part post Q&A will be specifically how you get yourself set up. So my students are in the room. You will stay after the Q&A and get set up for Thursday's exercise. So I just also want to acknowledge this amazing diversity of people in the room that we don't usually see at talks at NYUAD, from freshmen, undergraduates, all the way up to less freshmen, right, in the room. People from the community, lots of interesting people. Day 2 is in person only and is not on Zoom. So if you want to participate in day 2, we'll have a visit to special collections at 5 p.m. If you haven't signed up for that, those of you who were already signed up for the webinar, for this event yesterday, you will have received an email from me. If you did not get that and you'd like to come, we're going to be seeing examples of the Ahmed Zaki Abu Shadi collection and the Bushiri collection, 2 collections that have been recently acquired in our archives and special collections, and that's going to be led by Brad Bauer. We're also going to talk a little bit about ScanTent technology, which is this very portable, very low-cost, minimal technology for the digitizing of archives. And then we'll be back here after that. We have a little bit of a pause, iftar at the same time, and then after about an hour or so, when people still feel comfortable, we'll jump into the hands-on part. So that's basically our plan for Tuesday and Thursday this week. So I put on the screen here the goals of our workshop, because you could do a lot of different things in a workshop like this. I know that we have a very, very wide range of expertise and sort of interest points here, coming from people who are not really digitally connected necessarily, or not really digitally oriented as humanists, all the way to people who are coming from computational social science and or computing. And so it's just important for me to sort of tell you what we hope to get out of today. We're going to try to cater to all those audiences, but it's a high bar for today. So first of all, we're trying to provide a largely humanist-centered approach to recent developments in AI. This is important because we're not going to go deep into certain questions that may interest the more computer science crowd, but we can certainly talk about those in the Q&A. We want to discuss 2 technologies for creating text from digitized images. As I mentioned before, this OCR, or optical character recognition, and HDR, handwritten text recognition. Also going to discuss these 3 case studies using different languages and different scripts for this process. AI is notoriously English focused, right? Or very developed on the English language web. And so we are interested in other scenarios besides that. We're also going to discuss approaches to analyzing text deriving from our archival sources in different languages and scripts. What I mean by that is, once you get this process done, what could you do to gain some hands-on experience with one particular AI-based research tool, and that's Transkribus, which we're going to talk about. That's largely at the end of today's session on Thursday. And finally, but last but not least, right, to explore together possible futures of humanistic work with archival materials and AI. And I say here its promises and its discontents, and I really mean that. We're going to see over the course of the talk that as much as AI can be enabling, it can also be really limiting, right? And I think we have to be perspicacious, and we have to be intelligent about that, and also forthright about that, and think about those. What is the new skill set of critical thinking that goes along with that framework for research? So I'd like to start with a question and a couple images on the screen here. These are both from the QDL, from the Qatar Digital Library, from different moments of time. And my question is, how would you manage your research if you had a lot of digitized images of archives like this? And when I say how would you manage your research, what I mean is, what would you do on a daily basis? Would you download these onto your computer? Would you take, these are not things that you have print, would you print them out? Would you annotate on top of PDFs? Would you take notes on a separate document and then reference the URLs or the document number somehow so you can go back to them? How would you read them? How would you continue to read them as your research project unfolded? And how would you continue to read them and continue to derive information from them if we think about the reading process, human reading process, as one in which we see our documents differently every time we look at that? I'm not going to answer that question for you today, but what we're going to propose to you today is a way that you might actually be able to access these documents in a way which is other than just your eyes and your cognitive faculties looking at a digitized image of something and remembering by some means what's actually included in that. And so what we're getting at here is basically the idea of, and this for people who work on right to left script languages is actually be amazing, would be the searchability of archives like this. Let's say that you wanted to go looking for a specific word, or you wanted to go looking for pairs of words, or you wanted to do more different kinds of higher level analysis. How would you do that? So I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Suphan, who's going to continue.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this event. I also would like to thank the Humanities Research Fellowship for initiating the organization of this event, especially to Alex and Raya, if you hear me, for your diligent work and amazing attention to detail that actually really made this event possible. So while the focus of our workshop is obviously going to be on AI-driven text recognition technologies, especially HTR, I would like to start the conversation by very briefly discussing or pointing out to some of the recent advancements in AI technologies that have the potential to revolutionize the way we work with archives and cultural heritage collections, text-based cultural heritage collections. Among all of those, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, the most significant breakthrough in the recent years has been in the field of natural language processing, or NLP. Natural language here being human language, the language that we use to speak and communicate and write, as opposed to programming languages such as R or Python that the computers are able to process and operate with. NLP, what NLP makes it possible is to enable machines or algorithms, to be more precise, to understand, interpret, analyze, but also recently generate human language in very meaningful ways. And so these recent advancements in NLP have given rise to powerful AI models such as LLMs, or large language models. And the most famous and the most recent example of a powerful LLM model is ChatGPT-3, and I think it's on fourth version now, ChatGPT-4. And as all of you must have either heard of it, or you have probably already played around with it, and you must have seen or heard that these models, especially GPT, can generate very convincing human-like text based on the input that they are provided with. And so among many uses of LLMs, some of the most important ones in the sense of their potential contributions to humanities research is that they are able to extract valuable information, valuable insights from vast amounts of text. They can summarize complex documents. They can translate between languages, an example of which I will be sharing with you later in the presentation. And more importantly, in my opinion, large language models can process and analyze very large amounts of historical text, again with the purpose of helping us gain insights which we can otherwise not be able to gain. The caveat here is, as AI comes always with a caveat, these models, the large language models, tend to work best with European languages, especially with English. And these are obviously languages that are very well resourced. Whereas the performance of these language models are really questionable when it comes to non-European languages, but also historical languages and historical text. And I am going to be showing you an example of how ChatGPT does sometimes struggle with a non-European language in the case of Turkish language. So the final development in AI that I would like to highlight that is relevant to our topic, the topic of the workshop, is the recent developments in image recognition and analysis technologies. These are, again, for the purposes of this workshop, they play a very important role in deciphering historical text and in categorizing historical documents as well. Especially when it comes, they are especially useful when working with handwritten text and historical documents that might have complex layouts or that might have been produced with different handwriting styles. OCR and HDR, again, the topic of our workshop, these are two of the main text recognition technologies that rely on these recent improvements in image recognition and computer vision. And they do play, and we are going to demonstrate to you that these two technologies play a key role in improving the accessibility of historical archives and opening them up to higher level text analysis. With that, I would like now to turn our attention to OCR and HDR. OCR, optical character recognition. Again, it is a computer vision technology that converts images to text files, or to be more precise, OCR extracts text from image files, creates text documents that the computers then are able to read or process. In other words, with the help of OCR, we are creating computer readable or computer actionable text. We are converting images or photos into computer readable material. HDR, very much like OCR, is again a computer vision technology developed for the purpose of text recognition. The main difference between the two is that HDR is specifically geared towards the recognition of printed and handwritten historical material. So this is a technology that specifically focuses on historical text and historical text collections. Wrong button. Yes, I just thought I was on my own device, but yes. Okay, so to give just a tiny bit more detail about OCR, I'm pretty sure whether or not you have been aware of that. All of the participants in the room must have already used one or another OCR platform so far. OCR platforms or OCR software are integrated in some of the most commonly used text readers, such as Adobe. They are also available on many of the smartphone apps. So if you have a smartphone with iOS 13 and plus, a newer version, they do, for example, come with an inbuilt OCR reader in the photo app. And they tend to perform with very high accuracy, especially if you are trying to OCR printed text or English language text. They do a pretty good job. And in general, in languages that are written in Latin script, those out-of-the-box OCR systems do work pretty well. The challenge for scholars or for researchers who would like to use OCR for historical texts is that many of these commercially available OCR tools are trained primarily with Latin script texts, with English language text and with texts that are scraped from the web. That means they rely on the modern web content and they tend to perform, therefore, they tend to perform not as well for material, for text that is not in Latin script, that is not in English, or that is not printed. So that means while OCR is, as I said, when it comes to standardized Latin script text, it tends to perform very well. For languages, for material, it is written in handwriting, it is written in cursive and connected script, such as Arabic script, or historical material in general, even if they're in English. OCR does really, it leaves much to be desired, and this is exactly where HDR comes into picture. HDR, handwritten text recognition technology, as the name suggests, was really originally developed to work with handwritten material because of OCRs, the existing OCR technologies, the performance on this kind of text, and it learns, or to be more precise, HDR learns to recognize handwritten text, historical material, text from historical collections that might have very complicated page layouts, and also text written in cursive and connected scripts. I would like to highlight this last part several times because I do myself work with Ottoman Turkish, which is written in Arabic script, and I know that there are several researchers in the room who are also using Arabic script or other script that might be cursive and connected. HDR tends to do a pretty good job with that, and is a very good alternative to OCR. And in my opinion, what makes HDR really an ideal tool when it comes to working with historical collections, with corpora that might have several hundreds or thousands of pages, HDR allows users to custom create their own text recognition models. Again, here I am comparing to OCR. OCR tools, the commercially available out of box OCR tools, they do not allow the training and the improvement of the model. Whereas with HDR, you can actually custom create your own text recognition model. So you might be working on a, I don't know, 9th century Arabic text, or 20th century Ottoman Turkish text, or 19th century Urdu text. The OCR, the HDR platform that we use, Transkribus, lets you develop your own custom-built specific text recognition model. We are going to give an example of that later in the presentation. And in maybe another important point about HDR that I would like to highlight at this point is that at least in principle, HDR is language agnostic or language blind, which means that theoretically it can be taught to recognize any writing style from any language. It even allows passages between different language styles. For example, in my research, I use HDR to transcribe Arabic script Ottoman Turkish material to Latin script modern Turkish material. Again, I will be showing examples of that way or of that work later in the presentation. Maybe my favorite point, my favorite characteristic of HDR and of the HDR platform that we are using, Transkribus, is that it lets the user share their custom-built models with other researchers, and it also lets you share the transcription output that you produce with that with the HDR model that you develop. So it is much more closer to the spirit, open source spirit of digital humanities and humanities, hopefully, in general. So to conclude my bit of this portion of the presentation, I would like to say a few quick words about potential uses of OCR and HDR for historical research and for text-based humanities research in general. One of the most significant significant benefits of these two platforms, obviously, is that they make it possible to automate the transcription of this material. Again, if you are working like myself with 20,000 archival material in Ottoman Turkish, you can, in theory, read them one by one, and then try to annotate them manually, or you can HDR them with some amount of acceptable error rate, and then perform, for example, keyword search in the transcribed material. So keyword searchability, in other words, rendering historical collections, these large text collections or large corpora, in other words, keyword searchable, in my opinion, from the perspective of a historian, is a huge boon to our research. They also facilitate, once you have this text computer readable, once that that the algorithms are able to process these texts, you can also do higher level text analysis, data mining, etc. Don't worry if you don't know what text data mining or higher level text analysis is. We are going to show a few examples of that in the course of the workshop as well. I think at this point I'm going to pass it to David to transition to the next portion of the presentation.
So what we're getting to now is we're getting to this point where we'd like to take you from the theory, kind of, if you like, to the practice of some case studies. We have 3 case studies. The first one is very close to home, in a way, and not at all close to home in another way. They're the India office records of the colonial British administration. So the so-called Bushehr residency that was located in Bushehr in Iran, and that has a whole long run of handwritten ledgers in which a correspondence between the British India government in Mumbai and Bushehr was going on, but also a number of translations of incoming letters from local people, local sheikhs in particular, and those, verifying, that's not good. Oh, anyway. And then second, we're going to pass to the problem and the question of Ottoman Turkish periodicals. And Suphan's going to speak, and then I'm going to move you to something which might not seem particularly relevant in the context of today's work and discussion on the Arab world, but it's something that I've been working on with colleagues, and that's actually dealing with medieval Bibles. And I think that that's a particularly useful conversation, because what it does is it takes us into the pre-modern as a way of thinking about pre-modern textuality and the kinds of questions that come up and the problems that come up when one thinks about automating transcription. So the first part, again, are the Bushehr residency letters. These are the India office records, file R15-1. And if you know something about British colonial presence in the Gulf, we have this large, as I mentioned, this large stretch of documents that were evacuated from Bushehr, were sent to Bahrain, and then onward to the India Office Records archive in London. There's another copy of them apparently that exists, but this is the set of materials that the Qatar Digital Library chose to digitize. And so we're lucky that we're starting with this kind of mammoth, very expensive project of moving materials that are handwritten into a digital format for analysis. We have about 26,000 handwritten pages, 180 volumes of these. They're written in multiple hands, and of course this is a problem for AI. AI gets really good at recognizing one hand, but then all of a sudden you give it another hand and it's like, whoa, wait a minute. So teaching the machine to extrapolate, to generalize between different hands is really, that's the hardest part in some ways of this particular project that we've embarked on. On the other hand, there's a thematic unity that's incredible from these. So they're talking about similar kinds of questions over time, about pearling, about the slave trade, about ship movement around the Gulf, all kinds of interesting questions that people interested in the Gulf in the pre-war, pre-oil period would be interested in. It is not, however, computer readable. And by I mean that it's not computer searchable. These letters are not searchable except through the metadata, by which I mean they're only visible. You can only go because they've actually paid librarians to write descriptions of all of these letters. And you can find certain surface level access point to those documents. On the other hand, when you get past the 1870s, 1880s, when they introduced the typewriter, all of a sudden you're in some kind of a standardized format in which OCR works. So, but from the end of the 18th century through that point, these letters are basically, well, just human readable, but on the screen. Or if you happen to be there, you can see them there. So we've worked to automate this process, and we've been starting to pull in these various documents of different sorts. We've taken different approaches to that, and that question about how do you take different hands and train one model to, as I mentioned, to extrapolate or to move across to hands and understand. On the other hand, in the last, I don't know, in the last 6 months to a year, large models have been introduced from Transkribus, the so-called M3 models, which are trained on a lot of different English hands from many different periods. And so we're in this interesting point of having worked so hard to create custom models for our documents, only to find that large language models kind of have crept up alongside of us, probably like a lot of you feel with large language models, and that are actually performing really well in that domain. This training data for that project was largely created with student assistants at NYUAD. This project sort of sits inside of our research group here called Open Gulf, which is trying to think about how Gulf studies and digital humanities might actually work together a little bit. So just to give you another example of kind of the bespoke and the custom as opposed to the large language model, one of the papers that we've written that's in the list of papers at the end of this talk included some what's called named entity recognition. Entities are things like names of people, organizations, locations. There's a whole standard list of what entities are nowadays. But what we were very aware of is that our collections, because a lot of them are translated from Arabic, have a lot of words, a lot of names, a lot of things which are not recognizable very easily, right, by English language models. And so what we wanted to do was to kind of try to coax the models, as Suphan suggested, into understanding that. So we worked with an NER, or natural named entity recognition toolkit called Spacey, and we did some custom training trying to come up with specific customized entity types. So you can see here we're looking for things like people, or LOCs, which are locations, GPEs, geopolitical entities, quantities, all kinds of things we were searching, and we had a relative degree of success. It's just a lot of heavy lifting. Like training that kind of model is like, it requires annotation, it requires a lot of people to do work like that for you. And I'm not sure how sustainable that is, right? When we're working on this and we're not working in the context of a larger digital humanities group. On the other hand, you can take something like ChatGPT. This is version 4. Suphan created this. She's going to talk about. We're talking about a little bit later in other contexts. Do you want to say something about this, or do you want me to mention it? So what's really interesting is with a prompt, and I don't actually remember what your prompt was. I think it was something like,
let's see, perform basic text analysis.
Perform basic text analysis on this passage, right? We get things like sentiment analysis, the text appears to be neutral, et cetera, text summarization, keyword extraction, in which all of the named entities that we work so hard to customize before pop out here, more or less. Topic modeling gives you some main topics of the text. Very interestingly, it helps you to understand relationship extraction, right? It can actually tell you, given the text, like what people are related to each other and what is the nature of their relation. You can see affiliation, position, responsibility, friendship, position. And we have no idea, right? That's why I called this unsupervised in the black box. We have no idea the conditions by which these have been defined, but it actually provides us with this really wild way of imagining our relationship with archival textual materials, text classification and language detection.
Yeah, I would like to just point out what I personally find fascinating here is you can go from number 1, image number 1, a collection of documents in a digital library, to number 3, understanding, getting a very basic idea about the content of that collection, however many pages it is, with in a matter of a few minutes, practically, with a few clicks of a button. That, in my opinion, is really revolutionary. And I am very familiar with the content of this collection. I can assure you all of the information that ChatGPT provided here is correct. All the names, I was especially struck by the accuracy of the relationship extraction, how it was able to identify the relationship or the position of each individual in the text.
Yeah. So if any of you know anything about network modeling or network graphs, if you did this over a series, certainly over a series of texts over a series of time, you would have essentially the rudiments of a network model, right? The network visualization right there. Okay. So the second part is on Ottoman Turkish periodicals, and I'll pass back to Suphan.
Okay, so Ottoman Turkish presents a slightly more complicated problem for HDR because, as I pointed out earlier, when I say transcription of the Ottoman Turkish, I mean moving from the Arabic script Ottoman Turkish language to Latin script modern Turkish. So for those of you who are not familiar with Ottoman Turkish, it was the Arabic script language of high culture and administration in the Ottoman Empire from approximately from 14th century to 20th century. But with the demise of the Ottoman state and the creation of the Turkish Republic in the wake of World War I, Ottoman Turkish was outlawed for public use, and it was supplanted by a Turkified version of the language, which is written in Latin script. So today, any Turkish citizen who would like to read their cultural heritage text or any historical material from 1928 needs to get this specialized education in Ottoman Turkish, or they mostly rely on reading the transcriptions of these texts in modern Turkish. When I mean modern Turkish, I mean the Latin script version of these texts. So as you can imagine, moving from one script type or writing system to another writing system complicates the transcription process significantly, even when it is done by traditional methods in analog systems. Not only does this particular style of transcription requires workaround to address the issue of the different directionalities, text directionalities in our original material and in its transcription, but it also involves all of the challenges of transliterating Arabic script to Latin alphabet. So those of you who read Arabic script, or even if you don't read Arabic script, but you live in Abu Dhabi, you might have realized the same name or street name spelled out 10 different ways in Latin alphabet. So because of the lack of a standardized transliteration method, that also goes true for Ottoman Turkish. So in other words, it is a really challenging and demanding work to transcribe, move from Ottoman Turkish text to their modern Turkish version. I don't intend to go into the details of these issues, but if there is anyone who would like to hear more about them, I would be happy to address them during the Q&A. So we have been using Transkribus with the goal of making headways into automating the transcription of Ottoman Turkish material, especially from the mid and after 19th century, for several reasons, one of which is to improve the accessibility of this material to public, because like I said, the majority of the Turkish population today are actually not able to read these materials because they don't know how to work with the script. And so far, we have worked in our research. We are working with this particular collection that has already been digitized and made publicly available in one of the public libraries in Istanbul that contains about 400 pages of Ottoman Turkish periodicals that have been published after 1840s. One of the advantages of working with this collection is that although the typefaces for each publication is slightly different, they are still in the same domain. They are mostly about the same topics. They tend to have the same named entities. So the similarity in the language and in the domain helps to improve the accuracy rate of the text recognition models. So far, we have worked with 5 different publications from this particular digital repository, and currently we are experimenting with creating a general Ottoman Turkish print model, which is hopefully going to help us transcribe not only these 5 particular publications that we are working on, but a larger number of materials, larger number of Ottoman Turkish materials from this particular collection. And the most recent model that we trained was based on some 70,000 words. So it's a good size of training material. And the current character error rate is 7.9, which is not great, but it still helps. It is a very good starting point. We can always, in our workflow, our plan is to go back and manually correct the errors in the transcription output and to retrain the HDR engine to reduce the error rate even further. So hopefully we are going to be able to produce one of the first, if not the very first, computer readable Ottoman script corpus. The one point I would like to highlight, though, yes, it is now possible, even though it requires a non-trivial amount of work, it is possible to create a computer readable corpus for Ottoman Turkish. It does not necessarily mean that distant reading and text analysis is going to be immediately possible for these documents. To demonstrate that, I have run 2 experiments. I would like to start with the one on the right-hand side of the screen with ChatGPT, because that is in English and that is more accessible to the audience in the room. So the image on the left-hand side of the screen is one of those 5 periodicals that we are working with. This is a literary periodical from 1870s. I believe its name is Amit. So I extracted about 5 pages of transcription for this publication in Ottoman Turkish, transcribed to modern Turkish. So it is in Turkish, but in Latin alphabet. And I fed it to ChatGPT. I did not have much expectation, honestly, but I was very surprised to see that the language model actually did a very good job of understanding the content of it. Even though the text I fed it was in Latin script, it is different from modern Turkish, because Ottoman Turkish borrowed heavily from Arabic alphabet, from Arabic and Farsi, and even modern speakers of Turkish might not be able to understand the transcription of this material immediately because of the vocabulary differences. So it did a very good job of summarizing the content of the material. When it came to identifying named entities, however, remember David mentioned what named entities are. These are real life objects or entities like people, places, dates, etc. Again, it did an excellent job of translating them from Ottoman Turkish to English, but what ChatGPT was able to identify was not necessarily, they do not necessarily fall in the traditional categories of named entities. For example, the first one, Shukri Amidi, which ChatGPT identified as a person, is actually indeed a person and is indeed was indeed the publisher of this literary journal. And I was especially surprised to see that Umum-u Memaliki Osmaniye was translated as Ottoman Empire, which is a traditional named entity category. But then we have things like Erbab-ı İrfan ve Zeka, intellectuals and scholars, correct translation, but I don't think that this is a named entity category, right? Is it? Or, for example, Gülistan-ı Fazilet, Garden of Virtues, Maybe it has a custom built named entity category that I'm not aware of. But again, really good translation to English. I might actually be using this to get somewhere with translate my Ottoman Turkish material to English. But in terms of identifying traditional NLP categories, there is obviously much room for improvement. The second example I ran is only going to be meaningful for people who are able to read Turkish language, which is probably Peter and myself and Büşra here. I apologize to everyone else, but let me quickly explain to you what I did. So again, I fed the same text to Voyant tools. Some of you might be familiar with it. This is a web-based text analysis platform which is created specifically for humanities scholarship. And this particular visualization is supposed to be identifying relations or connections amongst the most frequently mentioned terms or concepts in a particular body of text. And the speakers or readers of Turkish language is going to be able to notice immediately what the problem here is. So these three terms we have here, Şehrinin, Şehrine, and Şehrinde, even though they are identified as three different tokens or three different words, they are actually the same word. They are different grammatical cases of the same word. So in a successful NLP analysis, when you are trying to identify links or connections between ideas, concepts, entities, what you would like to be able to do is to be able to identify the root of these words and then to count them as one. As you can see, this particular NLP tool fails to do so in the case of the modern Turkish as well as Ottoman Turkish. So the point I would like to make here is that even though all these recent developments with large language models, which NLP are very exciting and really have the potential to revolutionize the work when it comes to non-European languages, when it comes to historical material, there is still place for human in the room, in the group approaches, where humanities scholars really need to intervene and make these platforms, try and make these platforms work for our material. I think this is all I would like to say as far as the Ottoman Turkish materials goes. I would like to pass it to you now.
Thank you. So of course, remember, that's pretty amazing what we see, right? That was not possible a very, very short time ago. Many of those tools, and this is for my students and the students in the room who are learning these tools were created in the West with certain assumptions, linguistic and cultural assumptions baked into them, right? And so to kind of extract those, it's not an easy task, right? It's actually a deep rebuild of tools that's actually required, at least of a certain generation. Maybe we'll see other tools that come along that are not that don't require that. So I'm going to talk in this last section about medieval Bibles. These Bibles are in Latin, and again, I mentioned that this is not, while it's not directly relevant to this particular audience, it is relevant for the pre-modernist in us all, or the pre-modernist that will come out in all of you after having listened to my talk today. So talk about this. So this comes from the Paris Bible Project that I've been running with Estelle Deville, formerly of Blue Abu Dhabi, now at Yale, thinking about the transmission of texts, right? So medieval Latin Bibles, and this is my hand, so that gives you can see how big that Bible is, little tiny, what's called a pocket Bible. I saw this one when I was at Stanford recently. They are the first in the West, the first mass-produced object. These objects, these are written on parchment. They're codices that are essentially built for university culture that needs Bibles. Right? People need to be able to read those. And the interesting thing about them is that people and the historiography of these have always said that they're uniform objects, that in other words, they all have, and while that's true from the perspective of the content that's inside of them, the order of the books of the Bible, and there is a form of standardization, they are actually all bespoke and unique objects to the extent to which, and this might surprise people who know something about Quran, right, that the problem is that what's happened is that they all are written with different abbreviations. So you can take words in Latin and abbreviate them to make them shorter. And so there's been all these interesting historiography thinking about, like, do people abbreviate text because you want them smaller so that you put them in smaller books, or like, it's all kinds of interesting theses that float on around there. But so what this makes is this particular corpus, in which we have thousands of these all over the world. It's a really interesting place to look at material culture and textual transmission together. Super interesting, actually. They're all over the place. But unlike the two problems that we saw before, the Bouchier letters that are all in one place, that have been made in one place by a modern library, or the library that Suphan was talking about, that are in one place because of a large project done a little bit ago, these objects are actually scattered all over the place. And so this is what we have, problem of that we call sometimes the problem of legacy data. They're kind of all these different places, they're all in different formats, and so they're kind of difficult to get at. But when we put them all together, when we bring them all together, HTR becomes a really interesting way of thinking about what is a totally unknown process of creation and transmission of these documents. All of a sudden, we have this thing called the abbreviation, which provides us a way of thinking about patterns in that corpus. And so what we found, and this might sound completely ludicrous to someone, is that if you write the word in, like in Latin, if you write it I-N, or if you write it I with a bar on the top of it called a macron, is usually a distinguisher of whether it was done on the continent or whether it came from England. So something as simple as that, we can statistically show across a large corpus, which is really interesting for the history of these books. So AI is really useful for that. So these kinds of sources, medieval sources, you'll see on the left-hand side, there are different images that have been taken from Madrid, from Rome, and from Argao. And these are, of course, different digitizations done at different periods of time. The quality is unequal, and the information that we have about these is actually quite unequal too, but it's very time-consuming collecting this data. And it's really, the diversity of data in this kind of project is actually very important. Because there's a problem in machine learning called overfitting, which you might know about. Overfitting is when you have a representation of what something looks like. When AI sees something and knows something very well, it thinks everything is like that in a way, right? That's kind of like a layman's definition of overfitting. It goes and looks for things and sees what is not actually even there, right? It's one of the things that's also at the root of a lot of AI bias in today's world. So we have a lot of problems. Digitization quality, the metadata about these is terrible. They say something like maybe mid 13th century, maybe France, like we don't really know. And so we have a really interesting domain, just a lot of humanistic knowledge is required to make something like that, like this work. So AI does really well. This kind of HTR platform works really well at making the transcriptions, but a lot of kind of humanities is still left in the picture. So if any of you are worrying about humanities jobs going away by us talking about our topics today, that's absolutely not our point. Our point is that there's a development of a whole new way of thinking and a whole new set of skills that's really required for humanities of the future to really, in our opinion, to not just to confront AI, but to work with the kinds of platforms we've been talking about today. So one of the things we've been doing is just want to show you in examples on the screen what can happen when you improve a model. So this text on the left-hand side is from Lewis EM63, Free Library of Philadelphia. I think it's from Kings 3. But anyway, we have this thing about King David. You see the miniature with the image of King David. And then we're talking about the text that wraps around an image. And so in each of these boxes here, what I represent is the first one is a transcription just using somebody else's model that was created for Latin, in which we don't care about abbreviations, particularly. We're not really thinking about many things. He is interested in the long S as opposed to the S. He makes that kind of a distinction. But then the second box actually shows us with a refined version of the model, what we kind of get out. And by refined, I mean after correction, adding new data. And the third box really gets us to what we're actually trying to get to. That's the kind of transcription that you like. So the real difference in all, it's the same text, but it's a very, very different set of rules that are being applied, and we're sort of inching the platform closer and closer to this. So it's a bit similar to what we did with the Bouchier example. And we can get some really, really very granular information. So what we're trying to do basically here is take manuscripts and try to get as closest to the way that the scribes were writing as a way of understanding more of the similarities and differences between various manuscripts. So, since ChatGPT is the thing that we talk about today, I decided to do an experiment. I took Corpus Christi manuscript 249 in Cambridge, and on the left-hand side, I generated one of those abbreviation-rich transcriptions. And I said to ChatGPT, could you normalize, this is an example of an abbreviated text from a medieval Bible. Could you normalize and expand the abbreviations for me, please, as we say to AI right nowadays? And what I got out of it was, here's the expanded and normalized text. And it went through and it totally normalized the entire thing. Now, before you think that's amazing, I mean, the Latin Bible is on the internet, right? So it's out there. So all it's doing is it's looking for and probably finding sequences of words and saying, we know what part of the Bible this is. So we're going to produce that and we're going to give it to it. And then actually the part that's not shown on the screen here is say, oh, and by the way, you didn't ask me, but here's a translation of that into English. So that was really funny. On the right-hand side, this is where it gets, I think, the most interesting, is I said to it, take this portion of the Vulgate Bible and display it with abbreviations as one might find in medieval manuscripts. So I asked it to backtrack, right? In other words, I said, here, now we've normalized it, now unnormalize it. And what's interesting is that it unnormalizes it and it puts in a lot of possible abbreviations, but they're not the abbreviations from the original text. Which is a kind of, and then we're all of a sudden like, that's one of the moment when you get this little like, you know, the hair stands up on your back and you're like, where did it learn from that? Like, where was it? What was there that helped it understand what manuscript abbreviations are, that it can accurately give you quoque written with a little tilde. It's not my system of transcription, but it's someone's system of transcription. So we're in really fast-moving territory right now, right? And super interesting for our project. I'm not sure how we're going to use this exactly to our advantage, but I feel like there's something there that we haven't quite tapped into yet. So we'd like to conclude our 3 case studies and our introduction to HTR tonight with some questions, or rather some general challenges for unlocking archives with HTR. Now we can use the HTR word and not AI because you've all sat through our talk today. So some general conclusions, some general challenges. You're going to start? You want me to start? Go ahead.
You go ahead.
Okay, so languages matter, right? They definitely matter, especially with respect to the technologies that you have. Also, and I think this is the case of both the Bible project with the medieval texts and the abbreviations, and with Suphan's project of a changing script, audience and literacy matter. How we choose to transcribe, right, is a mediation between systems of literacy of the past, with historical materials, and contemporary literacies. And in a way, you could tell me that that's what, well, editing texts or textual criticism has always been about, something like that. That's true. But now in a system like HTR, in a system like an automated system, I think that really it really comes into relief. Choices in transcription matter. Sorry, that's not grammatical what I have on the screen. Choices in transcription matter. When you choose a certain word to represent a sound or a character in Turkish, in your transcription, when you choose a specific letter, this is an absolutely important choice that's going to be learned and is going to be reproduced for you by a machine.
I would like to add something, an example again from my study. For example, in the case of the Ottoman Turkish, is the speakers of Arabic language will know there are only 3, Arabic script is barely vocalized. Whereas in modern Turkish, every single sound is vocalized and written out. So there is a lot of missing vocalization when it comes to moving from Arabic script Ottoman Turkish to modern Turkish. In other words, we don't actually know how Ottoman Turkish sounded. We only have an educated guess. And when I transcribe, for example, 19th century Ottoman Turkish material to modern Turkish, I vocalize it in a way that I assume it was spoken by the educated elites of the 19th century Istanbul. But that means that I am, by making this choice, introducing a certain assumption and a certain bias into the transcription output, which in turn affects or influences the downstream analysis of the material in very significant ways.
And the equivalent of that in my case is that abbreviations are not singular, right? There are some abbreviations that stand for multiple things, and so context means a lot. And yet, when we don't have strong contextual models, strong contextual ways of thinking about those languages, we get a little bit uncomfortable with the kinds of decisions that we're making at this very beginning point. Multiple hands in manuscripts matter. It doesn't jump between hands perfectly well. Legacy data makes it harder, the research much harder. The less you have digitized, the more your objects are dispersed in the world and difficult to get your hands on, the more difficult they are. Archives also hide as much as they show. One of the things about working with the Bashir materials that we're very aware of is that we have materials that were written by non-native speakers in English. We have materials that were translated into English from other languages. And so we have this kind of multiple levels of language that are there. And just to throw it all together in the same pot is perhaps a little bit simplistic. Unsupervised models can only take us so far right now with the specificities of humanities research. So in other words, black boxes or things like ChatGPT, while they're evocative, we don't quite know where they're going, and we don't really have as much control there as we are used to in humanities research. Well-designed research questions are needed for HTR design choices. So if you're thinking about, hey, this would be really great in my own field, you really have to think carefully and along with a community of people who are doing that, how do the very basic choices that I make influence the way that I'm going to, this is just repeating what Suphan said, influence the way that I'm going to be able to understand my materials downstream. Deep humanistic knowledge is still required from experiment design and interpretation of outputs. And then finally, AI is moving very fast, but is it also leaving historical archives behind? And this is a question that I think is really important. And so communities like Transkribus that have at their very core historical specialists and people who are interested in the specificity of historical archives, we believe are really essential because they're not just, if you like, kind of paving over the past, right? Thinking about a future. So we have some, again, the slides for this were tinyurl.com/HRF, Humanities Research Fellowship Unlocking. We've got some suggested resources, some articles that we've written, some data sets and some other things that might be interesting if you're interested in learning a little bit more. And with that, I think what we'll do is we'll pass on to the Q&A. Before we pass on to the Q&A, I'd just like to thank the people who were with us virtually today and who listened to our talk. If they have any particular questions, they can contact us. And we're not going to be able to read the questions and do all that because we're going to stop the recording at this point. But thank you so much to everyone who's been online.